Last week, a friend of mine from Brighton came over and we started photographing in Granada and the white villages of the Piquira Valley. And as we photographed, we talked. And it seemed to me that a lot of this talk would be forgotten, blown away in the mists of time. And so we decided to make a video. Jerry is a great street photographer. He's someone whose work I've admired for years. And this was a fantastic opportunity to get together with him and talk about street photography. So without further ado, let's get into it. Here's the video.
This is my first visit to Granada as a photographer. I've been here before, but when you come as a photographer, you tend to look at it with different eyes. And I was not surprised by its beauty, because everything is just beautiful, but I loved the light. The light was just fantastic, and I loved the bright light. I think a lot of photographers tend to shy away from bright light, but I think the sunshine brings Granada to life in all its detail in the architecture. The footpaths are fantastic. I think normally footpaths can be completely dead. Certainly in Brighton, where I'm from, the footpaths are just uninteresting and you tend to keep them out of the frame most of the time, whereas Granadan footpaths are shiny and they're beautiful and they're geometric, and so you're kind of inclined to make the most of them. And I was taking pictures yesterday and they were, I was giving the footpath a lot of the foreground because of the reflections, and I think reflections is another thing. There are reflections everywhere, and the sunshine as well. You get these, because of the narrow streets, you get lots of pools of light, and I think pools of light are great for really graphic street shots, people walking in and out of the pools of light. I think it was yeah, it was a lovely surprise.
I mean, one of the things about street photography that's always interested me, and I'm primarily an architecture and landscape photographer. I kind of get involved in street photography, but one of the things for me is that I'm not naturally a person that will walk up and put my camera in someone's face and take a photograph of them for a variety of different reasons. And watching you in action yesterday, I was amazed at how easy the process was and how inconspicuous it was as well. I thought that was really interesting.
I do, over the years, I've learned how to make myself rather anonymous, and I think not draw attention to myself, try not to look through the lens of the camera, and because looking through the lens of the camera will always draw someone's eye, and be very casual about it. I don't necessarily go around with the camera hidden. I don't want to be, I like candid shots, but I just don't want to look as if I'm being sneaky. So I don't make a big deal of it, and I do like shooting from the hip. I've got a wide lens, so there's a lot of latitude with a wide lens anyway. But over the years, I pretty much know what's in the frame, and I find it quite relaxing. I don't find it in any way daunting. I think it's quite an easy process. I don't get fired up with adrenaline. It's just a joy for me.
Yeah, it's a very different process, isn't it, street photography? Coming from my background, I'm kind of used to having lots of time, an infinite amount of time to get the shot and to move my camera around, to move myself around and set it and so on and so forth. And when I first started taking pictures of people, I was constantly finding myself missing the shot, endless photographs of people disappearing out of the frame. And So you have to be that much quicker and anticipate.
That's so true, because some of the best street pictures are fleeting, and you either get them or you don't, and half a second later and they've gone. I think you get used to anticipating. I kind of watch people, and I can see people moving into spaces that I want to shoot, and so I think that the anticipation just comes with time, and I think if you look hard enough, you can actually work out the kind of dynamics of a street life, really. And so I do think you have to be on your guard, and also spot potential. I think it's not just anticipating movement, it's about spotting potential. And if I see groups of people, I think it's worth hanging around a bit, because something might happen. There's definitely going to be movement, and I think groups of people are easy to photograph, because there's rarely any objection to it, and everyone's pretty easy, and no one wants to stand out and make a fool of themselves by complaining about it. So I do tend to look for groups or things that are happening in the street. You know, someone walking out of a shop with a picture, or there are obvious things, but just be aware of what's going on around you, and I think you learn that over time.
One of the things that I've sort of learned over the years, and to do with architecture in particular, is use of angles, use of light and shade, and getting a dynamic into the picture. But you're dealing with a static object. The only thing that moves is you and your camera in that situation, so you can introduce choice into it. But with street photography, I personally find that much more challenging, because you're looking at the components, people in a scene, and waiting and hoping sometimes that they're going to fall into place, so that there's a spatial relationship and depth in the picture.
Indeed, yeah. I think I'm not a patient photographer. I'm very keen to get on around the next corner where there could be a better picture. But you do have to be patient sometimes, and that waiting for someone to walk into a space that makes the composition perfect is something that I do. And it can be very frustrating as well. I mean, but I think backgrounds, I mean, you talked about backgrounds. I think backgrounds and architecture are really important in street photography. I think a lot of street photography you think no one's really thought about the background, and I think the background can make a really great picture. And I mean, it's great in Granada, where you are just spoilt for choice with beautiful backgrounds, not just beautiful backgrounds, but kind of dramatic backgrounds and well-lit backgrounds, and you're given a choice here. But I do think that architecture or structure and street photography are inextricably linked, and they have to work together. We have to think about what's behind our subject. It's not just about the subject we shoot.
I think one of the interesting things about Granada as well is you've got this Moorish influence, which is very, very strong. So you've got sort of architecture through the ages, in a sense. You've got the Napoleonic grand buildings and sort of huge government buildings in the square, and then literally meters away from there you can get lost in tiny little alleys with you know, geraniums flooding off the balconies, and you can move from one to the other very, very quickly, and that's always part of the appeal of Granada to me. It's quite unlike any other city in that respect.
I love the contrasts. I think quite often when we talk about contrast in photography, we talk about light and shade, and yet that all sorts of contrast work, you know, colour contrast, but also old and young, old and modern, and you do see a lot of that, you know, the concrete compared with these beautiful Moorish designs, you know, juxtaposed in a single street, in a single shot. I think I do agree, yeah.
One of the things that I've been asked quite frequently in different genres of photography, but there's a saying that people must read in magazines and whatnot about narrative and story. And the question is always, a photograph surely is a static point in time, so how can there be a narrative and a story attached to it?
First of all, I think narrative in photography is really important. It's the storytelling element is often what not just draws people in, but it's what sustains them looking at the picture. Because I think in this kind of modern world of Instagram, we tend to look at a picture for a kind of microsecond and move on to the next. But I think a narrative, narrative can be developed in many different ways. I think as soon as you have a picture with a person, there's some sort of narrative there, and narrative doesn't have to be explained. Narratives can be however the viewer interprets it, and quite often that kind of open narrative can be quite a strong one. If you get two people in a picture, then I think we as human beings immediately assume that they're together or they're related together in some way, and that creates a narrative. And sometimes distance between people is a narrative. Are they friends, or are they just passing each other in the street? Becomes another narrative. I think narrative can come in many, many different ways.
And of course it can be different narratives, so the viewer makes a narrative as well. The viewer's the third party.
Indeed, and if you're close to people, an expression is a narrative, you know, and body language, gestures, these all contribute and create narratives, and it makes pictures more interesting.
And I think that's a good point as well about the scrolling culture that we have today, because there's almost a new imperative in photography that the photograph has to get the attention in the first instance. But recall the experience of reading a photography book. You're turning the page at your own pace, and you're in the picture for as long as you want to be, and you're not distracted by another 100 pictures on the same page. So there's a little bit of a tussle, I think, building up, because you've got that superficial, wow trigger that you want, because actually, in all honesty, we all want people scrolling on social media to look at our picture and not the one next to it. But then you also want it to be rewarding to look at for 30 seconds or a minute and ponder about the picture and what's the story and all the rest of it.
I do think that social media does tend to work better for kind of crowd-pleasing shots. The instantly dramatic shot will always catch your attention, and it's really about attention. But as you say, if you can actually crack it where you can pull people in and sustain them for 30 seconds, I think that's an achievement. I don't think it's an easy thing to do. And I think quite often the crowd pleasers are there and they get looked at, and you get the wow, and then you move on to the next picture. But it's quite often, I think, the narrative which keeps people looking at photographs. And also, I think what I find interesting is that people will look at a picture and create their own individual narratives. So you can get a number of different options. Just two people sitting apart a couple of meters can create a number of different narratives on how they relate to each other, and it does become fascinating. And even if we're not always aware of it consciously, it's there nagging us in the background about the space, or the space in itself can help the narrative. And it's there are so many options, I think, on creating a story in in a photograph, and they work in many different ways, but it does add to the interest of pictures.
So one of the other things that people talk a lot about or ask a lot about is this perennial question, what were your camera settings when you took this photograph? And I'm often at a loss when they ask me that, partly because I can't remember the settings half of the time, but also because surely that's not really the point. And light is so different days, different hours, different minutes. How then do we sort of nudge people along a road of being more conscious of the creative element than the technical?
I think you're right. I mean, the settings on a picture can change 4 stops, and just the change of the weather or the change of the time of day. I think it's good to give people a starting point, something that they're not wildly wrong with. And I think that will give them a bit of confidence in taking pictures. But in the end, they have to kind of work it out for themselves, I think, because we do live in a digital world where we can take hundreds of pictures and it costs us nothing. So I think playing around with settings, I on my camera, I play around with it all the time. All the basic settings I play around with. And because I wouldn't do that, of course, if it was a film camera, because I couldn't afford it. But because it's a digital camera, I think we need to just experiment with stuff more. And I don't think we really do enough of it. I think sometimes you experiment. I mean, experimenting can provide an awful lot of rubbish, a lot of rubbish shots. But if you kind of work something out, it can be a tool for the rest of your photographic life. So I do think it's really important that we play around with stuff, and even if we just want to photograph some specific thing, I think it contributes to our understanding of how the camera works, and the better we are with our cameras, the better pictures we will take.
And I think one of the things that I've often found myself saying to people is that what you're aiming for, particularly in street photography, because it's such a fleeting moment and it passes so quickly, so you almost need to develop an instinctive understanding of the settings. So you can look at a scene and know pretty much what the ballpark is going to look like, depending on what your priorities are, whether you want to show movement or whether you want, reduced depth of field and so on.
The more you understand the camera, then the more of the control you have, and I think letting the camera take control of your picture by shooting everything on automatic. I'm not saying there aren't times when automatic is really useful, because it is, but I think if you can actually shoot and understand what the camera's doing, you will have control and there is less disappointment. I've like just using autofocus, how many times have I looked at a picture when I've shot autofocus and the camera has photographed on the wrong thing? It's photographed on the foreground and not the background, which is what I wanted. And I think when you're, particularly when you're doing street photography, when things happen so quickly, and you have to you have to be aware of so many different things at the same time, and the more instinctive those actions become, the quicker it is. Also, the less you ask the camera to do, the quicker the camera behaves. If you ask the camera to work out everything itself, it will just be a tiny bit slower, and if you're talking about one of those fleeting moments, then you might miss it. So I do think learning basic camera settings and control is ultimately a big plus if you're doing any photography really, but I think particularly street.
And you'll use a lot less batteries.
Indeed, all manner of benefits.
Jerry and I are hosting a workshop next April in Granada. If you're interested in that, go to the website, that's 8peaks.photography, and start the conversation. But in the meantime, we'll see you next week. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye now.